It was a busy morning at one of the largest film studios in Los Angeles. Spotlights burned overhead, cameras rolled across shining tracks, and assistants rushed back and forth with clipboards in their hands. Actors in expensive costumes rehearsed their lines in front of giant green screens while makeup artists gave last-minute touch-ups. Everywhere you looked, there was noise, movement, and importance. And in the middle of all that chaos was a quiet old janitor. He moved slowly, almost invisibly, pushing a worn cleaning cart across the polished floor. His uniform was simple, slightly faded, and his gray hair was neatly combed back. While everyone else chased fame, deadlines, and million-dollar scenes, he focused on a small puddle of spilled coffee near stage 4. No one greeted him. No one thanked him. Most people didn't even notice him. A young actor accidentally brushed past him and muttered, "Watch it," without turning his head. 2 crew members stepped around his mop as if he were just another piece of equipment. The old man didn't react. His face remained calm, his movements steady, his eyes observant, quietly taking in everything happening around him. On the main set, the film's powerful director had just arrived. His voice echoed through the studio as people straightened their posture and rushed to obey his orders. Everyone feared his temper. Everyone knew one mistake could get them thrown off the project. And at that exact moment, the janitor slowly pushed his mop onto the director's path, unaware that in a few seconds, their worlds were about to collide. Because the most ignored man in the building was the one person who had the power to shut the entire production down. And someone was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The director's arrival changed the energy of the entire studio. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Assistants began walking faster. Even the background extras straightened their posture as his sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "Why is this light still here? Who approved this setup? We're losing money every second." He didn't walk, he stormed. Surrounded by producers and crew members, he moved like a man who believed the entire world existed only to serve his vision. At the same time, near stage 4, the old janitor had just finished cleaning a small spill. He carefully placed a yellow warning sign on the floor and stepped back, giving space for people to pass safely. His movements were slow, precise, almost respectful toward the environment around him. He didn't see the director coming. The director, too busy shouting over his shoulder at an assistant, stepped forward without looking. His expensive shoe landed directly on the wet floor. In one sudden moment, his foot slipped. His body jerked forward, his balance broke, and he grabbed the shoulder of a passing crew member to stop himself from falling. A dark stain spread across the polished leather of his designer shoe. Silence. The people around him froze. For a brief second, no one moved, because everyone knew what was about to happen. The director slowly looked down at his ruined shoe, then at the wet floor, and finally at the janitor holding the mop. His face hardened. "Why you?" The word echoed across the set. The janitor immediately lowered his head slightly, not in fear, but in politeness. "I'm very sorry, sir," he said softly. "The floor was just cleaned. I placed the sign." Before he could finish, the director kicked the warning sign across the floor. "Do you have any idea how much these shoes cost? Do you even know where you are? This is not some street corner. This is my set!" Dozens of eyes turned toward them. Cameras that had been ready to film were now secretly recording something else. The janitor gently pulled the mop back, clearing the director's path. "I'll clean it again right away," he said calmly. No anger, no argument, no attempt to defend himself. And that calmness made the director even more furious. "Don't talk, just disappear." "People like you slow everything down." A few crew members exchanged uncomfortable looks. One young assistant whispered. It was clearly marked, but stopped when the director turned his head slightly. The janitor bent down and began wiping the floor again, not rushing, not trembling, just doing his job with the same quiet dignity. That was something the director wasn't used to. He was used to people apologizing desperately. He was used to fear. He was used to power. But this man was calm, and somehow that calmness felt like resistance. The director stepped closer and spoke louder, making sure everyone could hear. "If you can't even clean properly, you shouldn't be working here. Who hired you? I want him gone before the next scene starts." The word spread through the set like a shockwave. Fired, just like that. For a small accident, the janitor finally looked up. Not with anger, not with pleading, just with steady, unreadable eyes. For a brief moment, the noise of the studio faded into the background. The flashing lights, the moving crew, the expensive equipment, none of it seemed to matter. There was something unusual about the way he stood there, something that didn't match the simple uniform he was wearing. But the director didn't notice. He turned away, already shouting new orders, convinced the situation was finished. The janitor quietly moved his cart to the side of the set. No arguments, no complaints, as if losing his job meant nothing to him. And that was the moment when a few people in the crew began to feel that something wasn't right. Because most people, when humiliated in front of hundreds of others, show emotion. But this man showed none. Only calm, only patience, as if he knew something that no one else did. And as the director continued yelling about camera angles and budgets, the old janitor slowly reached into his pocket. Not to take out a phone yet, not to react, but simply to check the time like a man who wasn't worried at all. As if this entire situation was just a small delay in a much bigger plan. And far across the studio lot, black luxury cars had just entered through the main gate. No one on the set had seen them yet. But the moment they arrived, everything was going to change. Before we move to the next part, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone stay calm while being disrespected, and it made the other person even more angry? Within minutes, the tension that had started as a small incident began to spread across the entire set. The director's voice kept rising, louder than before, not because the situation still mattered, but because his ego did. He repeated the story to anyone who came near him, exaggerating the slip, pointing toward the janitor as if he were the symbol of everything that slowed him down. People like that don't belong in a professional environment, he said, making sure the actors, the crew, and even the background staff could hear. Some nodded silently, some looked away, and some kept recording with their phones, pretending to check messages. Near the edge of the set, the janitor continued his work. He had moved to another small corner, where dust had gathered near a lighting stand. His movements were the same, steady, careful, almost peaceful, as if the shouting behind him was happening in a different world. That contrast began to pull people's attention. A costume designer paused mid-step and watched him for a moment longer than necessary. A camera operator whispered to the assistant beside him, "Why does he look so calm?" Because it wasn't normal. Anyone else would have rushed. Anyone else would have tried to explain. Anyone else would have shown at least a hint of anger or embarrassment. But this man didn't. The director noticed the shift in attention, and it irritated him. He walked toward the janitor again, this time slower, more deliberately, like a man trying to prove a point. "Didn't you hear me?" he snapped. "You're done here. Take your cart and get out of my sight." The janitor stopped. He placed the cloth back into the bucket, straightened up, and faced the director. Up close, the difference between them was even more striking. One man dressed in expensive fabrics, surrounded by status and noise. The other in a simple uniform, standing alone yet somehow completely unshaken. "I will leave when I finish this section," the janitor said quietly. It should not remain dirty for the next scene. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't submission. It was something else, something that made the people nearby exchange glances again. The director let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're giving me conditions now," he said loudly. "You think you have authority here." He turned to the crew and spread his arms. "Look at this! The janitor is negotiating with me!" A few forced laughs echoed across the set, but they died quickly. The atmosphere had changed. The humiliation was no longer entertaining, it was uncomfortable. Still, the director wasn't finished. He stepped forward and grabbed the janitor's cleaning cart, pushing it aside so hard that one of the wheels lifted off the ground and slammed back down. The metal rattled sharply in the quiet. "You clean when I say. You leave when I say. That's how this works." The janitor's eyes followed the cart as it rolled a short distance away. For the first time, he didn't move to fix it immediately. He simply looked back at the director, not with anger, not with fear, but with a long, measured silence that felt heavier than any argument. That silence spread. The actors who had been rehearsing stopped speaking. The makeup artist lowered her brush. Even the assistant stopped pretending to work. Something was happening, and everyone could feel it. The director misread that silence as victory. He took one more step forward, close enough that only the janitor could hear his next words, but he spoke them loud enough for the nearby crew. "You should be grateful you were allowed to work here at all. People like you are replaceable." A few heads lowered, because deep down, everyone knew those words weren't just meant for the janitor. They were meant for all of them. The janitor finally bent down and picked up the fallen cart, setting it upright with slow precision. He adjusted the handle, straightened the mop, and wiped a drop of water from the metal surface. Every movement controlled, every gesture calm. And that calmness, instead of ending the confrontation, made the director lose the last bit of control he had. In a sudden burst of anger, he reached forward, grabbed the janitor's ID badge hanging from his pocket, and pulled it free. The plastic clip snapped. The badge, the small symbol of his position in the studio, now in the director's hand. People gasped softly. The director held it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, "means nothing now." And with a sharp motion, he tossed it toward a nearby trash bin. It hit the edge and fell inside. The sound was small. But in the silence of the set, it felt final. Because in that moment, the line had been crossed, not just between a director and a janitor, but between arrogance and something far more powerful that no one had recognized yet. And the man everyone thought was powerless still hadn't reacted. For a few long seconds after the ID badge disappeared into the trash bin, no one on the set moved. The air felt heavy, as if the entire studio had stopped breathing at the same time. The director stood there, chest rising and falling, convinced he had just proven his authority. In his mind, the situation was finished. The problem had been removed. Control had been restored. But something about the silence was different. This wasn't the usual silence that followed his outbursts, the nervous, obedient quiet of people trying to avoid becoming the next target. This silence felt watchful. The janitor slowly turned his head toward the trash bin. No rush, no panic, no humiliation. He walked toward it with the same measured steps he had used all morning, as if nothing had happened. The sound of his shoes against the polished floor echoed in the stillness. He stopped beside the bin and looked down. For a brief moment, his reflection appeared on the metallic surface, not the reflection of a defeated worker, but of a man completely in control of himself. He bent slightly, reached in, and pulled the ID badge back out, a small piece of plastic, wet from a spilled drink, covered in dust. He didn't wipe it on his uniform. Instead, he took a clean white cloth from his cart and carefully cleaned it, the way someone would clean something valuable. People watched in confusion. Why would a man who had just been fired treat his badge with such care? The director shook his head and let out an impatient breath. "I told you to leave," he snapped. "You don't work here anymore." The janitor looked at the badge for one last second, then placed it quietly into his pocket. Only then did he raise his eyes to meet the director's, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "I was never here for the job." The words didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like a fact. The director frowned, not understanding. "What is that supposed to mean?" he demanded. The janitor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved past the director, walked back to his cart, and adjusted the mop handle that had been knocked sideways earlier. He fixed the wheel that had been bent, making sure it rolled smoothly again. Small, precise movements. As if he had all the time in the world. As if nothing the director had done had any real effect. That was the moment when the first real wave of unease moved through the crowd, because power usually creates reaction. Fear, anger, submission. But this man, he was unaffected. The director stepped forward again, his voice sharper now, not louder, but more desperate to regain control. "You think this is a joke? Security," he called out, looking around. "Why is he still here? I want him out now." Two security guards at the far end of the set looked at each other, uncertain. They had seen the entire incident. They had also seen the janitor's face, and something about it made them hesitate. Before they could move, the janitor reached into his pocket. The motion was slow enough for everyone to see. Not aggressive, not dramatic. He simply took out a phone. Not an old phone, not a cheap phone. A sleek, dark device that didn't match the rest of his appearance. The director laughed under his breath. "Oh, now you're calling someone. Go ahead. Call whoever you want. You're still finished here." The janitor looked at the screen for a moment, then placed the phone against his ear. When he spoke, his voice was low, so calm that the people closest to him leaned in slightly to hear. "Yes," he said. "I'm on stage 4. A short pause. "There seems to be a misunderstanding." That was all. No explanation, no complaint, no urgency. He ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. The director spread his arms in disbelief. "That's it. That's your big move," he mocked. "You think someone is coming to save you." The janitor looked at him, and for the first time, there was something new in his expression. Not anger, not pride, but quiet disappointment. "I tried to stop this," he said softly. "Not for me, but for you." Those words landed differently. They didn't sound like the words of someone powerless. They sounded like a warning that had come too late. A murmur moved through the crew. "What does he mean?" Someone whispered. And then, from far outside the studio building, a sound reached them. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The synchronized closing of multiple car doors. The director didn't notice. He was still staring at the janitor, waiting for a reaction that never came. But the people near the large studio entrance did notice. They turned their heads. Because through the glass walls at the far end of the set, black vehicles had just pulled up. And suddenly, the security guards who had hesitated earlier straightened their posture, not because of the director, But because they had recognized those cars. Something was about to change. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the director was no longer the most powerful person in the room. The sound from outside was faint, so faint that the director didn't even turn his head. But the crew near the entrance had. Through the tall glass panels of the studio, dark vehicles were now visible, parked in a perfect line. Their polished surfaces reflected the morning sun, and for a moment it looked less like an arrival and more like a silent statement. Inside, the janitor stood exactly where he had been, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his cleaning cart, calm, patient, unmoved. The director let out an irritated sigh, mistaking the shifting attention of the crew for boredom. "Why is everyone just standing there?" he shouted. "We're burning daylight. Back to your positions." But no one moved the way they used to when he gave orders. Because now, their eyes were moving between two things, the entrance and the old janitor. Something didn't connect. Something didn't make sense. The wardrobe assistant leaned toward the cameraman and whispered, "Why would someone like him not react at all?" The cameraman replied under his breath, "Because he knows something we don't." Near the lighting rig, the two security guards suddenly adjusted their jackets, standing straighter, not in response to the director, but to the figures who had just stepped out of the vehicles. Back on the set, the director was still speaking, still trying to reassert control. "This is what happens when you let unqualified people walk around a professional environment," he said loudly, pointing toward the janitor without even looking at him. "No discipline, no standards." The janitor finally spoke again, not loudly, not to interrupt, but in a tone that carried across the quiet set. "Sir," he said gently, "this is your last chance to let it end with dignity." The director turned slowly, a cold smile forming on his face. "Are you threatening me?" "No," the janitor replied. "I am giving you an opportunity." That answer confused everyone. An opportunity. From a man who had just been fired. The director stepped closer, lowering his voice so it sounded more personal, more cutting. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said. "You have no power here." The janitor didn't move. And that stillness now felt heavier than anything else in the room, because at that exact moment, the large studio doors at the far end opened. Not violently, not dramatically. They opened with controlled precision. Several sharply dressed individuals walked in, not looking around in curiosity like visitors, but scanning the space like people who already knew exactly where they were going. Their presence changed the atmosphere instantly. Conversation stopped. Crew members stepped aside without being told. Even the assistant directors, the people who normally answered only to the main director, moved out of the way, but the director himself still had his back turned. Still speaking, still unaware. "You should have left when I told you," he continued. "No security will escort you out." The janitor's eyes shifted briefly past him, not in hope, not in relief, but in simple acknowledgement. As if he had been expecting this exact timing, one of the newcomers spoke quietly to the head of studio security. A few documents were shown. A short nod followed, and then the head of security's entire posture changed. He walked toward the set, not toward the janitor, but toward the director. That was the first moment something felt wrong to him. He noticed the movement in the corner of his eye and turned slightly. But before he could speak, the janitor said one more sentence, the same calm tone, the same steady presence. "I told you," he said. "The real power was never standing in front of you." Those words didn't sound like a victory. They sounded like a conclusion. The director frowned, confusion finally breaking through his confidence. Because for the first time since the incident began, he realized no one was looking at him anymore. Every eye was focused behind him, and the energy in the room had completely shifted. Respect, the kind he demanded through fear, was now being given freely. But not to him. The approaching footsteps stopped just a few feet away, and in the polished reflection of a camera lens, the director saw something that made his expression change. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. Because the people walking toward him weren't part of his production team. They were people he had only ever seen in boardroom meetings. At the very top of the studio hierarchy. And they weren't looking at him. They were looking at the janitor. What do you think matters more? A person's position or their character? Type your answer in the comments before the reveal. The footsteps stopped just behind the director. For the first time since the confrontation began, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because the silence around him had changed. It was no longer the silence of people trying to avoid his anger. It was the silence of people waiting for his reaction. Slowly, he turned. Standing in front of him was the studio's executive board. The same people whose calls he never ignored. The same people he addressed with forced politeness in private meetings. At the center of them stood the studio owner himself, a man who never came to the set, a man whose time was too valuable for daily production problems. And yet, here he was. The director's confident posture collapsed into stiff formality. Sir, I wasn't informed you were coming," he said quickly, adjusting his jacket, trying to recover his authority. But the studio owner didn't even look at him. Not for a second he walked past him, straight toward the janitor. Every step echoed across the silent set. Crew members moved aside instinctively. Actors lowered their gaze. The security guard stood at full attention. The old janitor didn't move. He simply waited. When the studio owner reached him, his expression, which was known to be cold and unreadable in meetings, changed completely. "Respect, genuine respect, Mr. Seagal," he said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We've been trying to reach you all morning. I hope you weren't kept waiting." A wave of shock moved through the entire set. The name traveled from one person to another in whispers. Seagal. Seagal. The director's face lost all color. The janitor, the quiet, invisible man he had just humiliated, was now being addressed with a level of respect he himself had never received. The old man gave a small nod. "I was observing," he replied simply. "Observing, not working, not cleaning, observing." The meaning of every calm movement, every silent glance, every moment of patience suddenly became clear. The studio owner turned slightly toward the board members. "This," he said, gesturing respectfully toward the man in the janitor's uniform, "is the executive producer of this entire film." Another wave of shock. The director took a step back. His mind tried to reject what he was hearing. Executive producer. That meant the man who financed the project. The man whose approval determined whether the film existed or not. The man above everyone, including the director. But the studio owner wasn't finished. And, he continued, the man we were hoping would personally take the lead role. The crew gasped openly now, because everyone knew the rumors. The legendary martial artist. The Hollywood icon who had stepped away from the spotlight. The man the studio had been trying to convince for months to return. He had been here. Not in a suit. Not surrounded by assistants, but with a mop in his hands. Watching, learning. Testing, the director's legs felt weak. All the moments replayed in his mind at once. The shouting, the insults, the kick bucket, the torn ID badge in the trash. Each memory now heavier than the last. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, to say anything that could undo what had happened. But no words came out, because for the first time in his career, he had no authority. The janitor, no Steven Seagal, reached into his pocket and took out the cleaned ID badge. He looked at it for a moment, then handed it calmly to the studio owner. "I believe this belongs to your system," he said. No accusation, no anger, just a quiet statement. The studio owner's expression hardened slightly as he understood what that meant. He turned to the head of security. "Is this how our guests are treated on this set?" he asked. The question wasn't loud, but it carried more power than all of the director's shouting combined. The head of security shook his head immediately. "No, sir." The entire crew now stood frozen in place, watching the complete reversal of power. The director, who had controlled everything minutes ago, now looked smaller than anyone had ever seen him. Finally, he forced the words out. "Mr. Seagal, I didn't know." Steven looked at him, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the same calm disappointment he had shown before. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the problem." The words landed deeper than any punishment, because they weren't about status, they were about character. And in that moment, the director realized that the man he had tried to throw out of the studio was the only person who had the power to decide whether he stayed. No one on the set dared to move. The powerful director, the man whose voice had controlled every second of the production, now stood completely silent, waiting for a decision that was no longer his to make. All eyes shifted to Steven Seagal. But he didn't look like a man who had just won. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't enjoy the moment. Instead, he slowly looked around the set. At the camera operators who had been working since sunrise, at the assistants holding heavy folders, at the makeup artist standing quietly in the corner, at the cleaning staff near the back, people who, just like him an hour ago, had been invisible. His gaze stopped there for a second longer, because that had been the point. Not the insult, not the humiliation, the truth. He stepped forward, not toward the director, but toward the crew. "When I walked into the studio today," he said calmly, "I wasn't looking at the lights or the cameras or the budget." His voice wasn't loud, but every word reached the farthest wall. "I was looking at how people treat those who cannot give them anything in return." The director lowered his eyes. The studio owner remained silent. "Respect," Steven continued, "is not a reward for status." He gently placed the mop back into the cleaning cart. It is a basic form of humanity. The entire set listened without a sound, because now, no one was hearing him as a janitor. No one was hearing him as a producer. They were hearing him as a man. He finally turned toward the director. For a moment, it looked like this would be the moment of punishment everyone had been expecting. The end of a career, the public removal of power, the consequence. The director's voice trembled. "I am deeply sorry," he said. "I judged you without knowing who you were." Steven held his gaze. "And if I had actually been just a janitor?" he asked softly. The question hit harder than any accusation. Because there was no good answer, the director couldn't speak. Steven stepped closer, not in dominance, but in calm presence. "You didn't disrespect me because of who I am," he said. "You disrespected me because of who you believed I was." A long silence followed. Then Steven did something no one expected. He turned to the studio owner. "The film continues," he said, with the same director. A wave of shock moved through the crew. The director looked up, unable to believe what he had just heard. Steven wasn't finished. "But," he added, "from tomorrow morning he will arrive 2 hours early." The director swallowed. "To work with the cleaning team. To understand the value of every person on this set. No anger, no revenge. A lesson, the kind that changes a person if they are willing to learn." Tears formed in the director's eyes as he nodded. Not because he had been saved, but because for the first time he understood. The power he had used all his life had never been real power. Steven picked up the cleaning cart and rolled it slowly back toward the side of the set. Halfway there, a young production assistant ran forward. "Sir, you don't have to do that anymore," she said. Steven smiled slightly. "This," he replied, "was never a job." He parked the cart neatly in its place. Then he walked toward the exit, passing through the same path where, earlier, no one had noticed him. This time, people stepped aside with respect. Actors nodded, crew members placed their hands over their hearts, and the cleaning staff, the ones who had remained silent the entire time, stood a little taller, because one of their own had just reminded the world of their worth. At the door, Steven stopped for a moment and looked back at the set. Not at the lights, not at the cameras, at the people. "Never measure a human being by their position," he said. "Measure them by their behavior." And then he walked out. The studio remained silent long after he was gone, not out of fear, but out of reflection, because everyone there knew. They had just witnessed something far more important than a film. They had witnessed a lesson they would never forget. If you believe respect should be given to every person, no matter their job or status, comment RusPT4AL and tell me, have you ever seen someone judged by their appearance, and later everyone realized their mistake?